Chapter 5 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 5 Men and Masters.
"Well, Stephen,"
said Bounderby, in his windy manner,
"what's this I hear? What have these beasts of the earth been doing to you? Come in and speak up."
It was into the drawing-room that he was thus bidden. A tea-table was set out, and Mr. Bounderby's young wife, and her brother, and a great gentleman from London were present, to whom Stephen made his obeisance, closing the door and standing near it, with his hat in his hand.
"This is the man I was telling you about, Harthouse,"
said Mr. Bounderby. The gentleman he addressed, who was talking to Mrs. Bounderby on the sofa, got up, saying in an indolent way,
"Oh, really?"
and dawdled to the hearth-rug where Mr. Bounderby stood.
"Now,"
said Bounderby.
"speak up."
After the 4 days he had passed, this address fell rudely and discordantly on Stephen's ear. Besides being a rough handling of his wounded mind, it seemed to assume that he really was the self-interested deserter he had been called.
"What were it, sir?"
said Stephen.
"As you were pleased to want with me?"
"Why, I've told you,"
returned Bounderby.
"Speak up like a man, since you are a man, and tell us about yourself, and this combination."
"With your pardon, sir,"
said Stephen Blackpool,
"I ha' nowt to say about it."
Mr. Bounderby, who was always more or less like a wind, finding something in his way here, began to blow at it directly.
"Now look here, Harthouse,"
said he.
"Here's a specimen of 'em. When this man was here once before, I warned this man against the mischievous strangers who are always about, and who ought to be hanged wherever they are found, and I told this man that he was going in the wrong direction. Now would you believe it, that although they've put this mark upon him, he's such a slave to 'em still, that he's afraid to open his lips about 'em."
"I said I had nowt to say about it, sir, nor as I were fearful of opening my lips."
"You said? I know what you said. More than that, I know what you mean, you see. Not always the same thing, by the Lord Harry. Quite different things. You had better tell us at once that that fellow Slackbridge is not in the town stirring up the people to mutiny, and that he is not a regular qualified leader of the people. That he is a most confounded scoundrel. You'd better tell us so at once. You can't deceive me. You want to tell us so. Why don't you?"
"I'm as sorry as you are, sir, when people's leader is bad,"
said Stephen, shaking his head.
"They take such as offers. Haply 'tis the smallest of their misfortunes when they can get no better."
The wind began to get boisterous.
"Now you'll think this pretty well, Harthouse,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"You'll think this is tolerably strong. You'll say, upon my soul, that this is a tidy specimen of what my friends have to deal with. But this is nothing, sir. You shall hear me ask this man a question. Pray, Mr. Blackpool, may I take the liberty of asking you how it happens that you refuse to be in this combination?"
"How's happens?"
"Ah,"
said Mr. Bounderby, with his thumbs in the arms of his coat, and jerking his head and shutting his eyes in confidence with the opposite wall.
"how it happens?"
"I'd liefer not come to it, sir, but sin as you ask question, and I'll not want it be ill-mannered, I'll answer. I ha' passed a promise."
"Not to me, you know,"
said Bounderby. Gusty weather with deceitful calms, one now prevailing.
"Oh no, sir, not to you."
"As for me, any consideration for me has had just nothing at all to do with it,"
said Bounderby, still in confidence with the wall.
"If only Josiah Bounderby of Coketown had been in question, you would have joined and made no bones about it."
"Why, yes, sir, 'tis true."
"Though he knows,"
said Mr. Bounderby, now blowing a gale,
"that there are a set of rascals and rebels whom transportation is too good for. Now, Mr. Harthouse, you've been knocking about the world some time. Did you ever meet with anything like that man out of this blessed country?"
"Nay, ma'am,"
said Stephen Blackpool, staunchly protesting against the words that had been used, and instinctively addressing himself to Louisa, after glancing at her face.
"Not rebels, nor yet rascals. No to kind, ma'am, no to kind. They've not done me a kindness, ma'am, as I know and feel. But there's not a dozen men amongst 'em, ma'am, a dozen, not 6, but what believes as he's done his duty by rest and by his cell. God forbid as I as has known, as had th' experience of these men all my life, I as has etten and drunken wi' 'em, and seaten with 'em when I'm toiling wi' 'em, and loving 'em, should fail for stand by 'em wi' truth, let 'em as has done to me what they may."
He spoke with the rugged earnestness of his place and character, deepened perhaps by a proud consciousness that he was faithful to his class under all their mistrust, but he fully remembered where he was, and did not even raise his voice.
"No, ma'am, no. They're true to one another, faithful to one another, affectionate to one another, into death. Be poor amongst 'em, sick amongst 'em, grieve amongst 'em, ony the mony causes that carries grief to the poor man's door, and they'll be tender wi' yo, gentle wi' yo, comfortable wi' yo, christen wi' yo. Be sure of that, ma'am. They'll be riven to bits ere ever they be different."
"In short,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"it's because they're so full of virtues that they've turned you adrift. Go through with it while you're about it. Out with it."
"How it is, ma'am,"
resumed Stephen, appearing still to find his natural refuge in Louisa's face,
"that what is best in us folk seems to turn us most to trouble and misfortune and mistake. I dunno, but 'tis so. I know it is, as I know th' heavens above me ain't smoke. We're patient too, and wanting general to do right, and I canna think the fault is all wi' us."
"Now, my friend,"
said Mr. Bounderby, whom he could not have exasperated more, quite unconscious of it though he was, than by seeming to appeal to any one else,
"if you will favour me with your attention for half a minute, I should like to have a word or two with you. You said just now that you had nothing to tell us about this business. You're quite sure of that before we go any further?"
"Sir, I'm sure on it."
"Here's a gentleman from London present."
Mr. Bounderby made a back-handed point at Mr. James Harthouse with his thumb.
"A Parliament gentleman. I should like him to hear a short bit of dialogue between you and me, instead of taking the substance of it, for I know precious well beforehand what it will be. Nobody knows better than I do. Take notice. Instead of receiving it on trust from my mouth."
Stephen bent his head to the gentleman from London, and showed a rather more troubled mind than usual. He turned his eyes involuntarily to his former refuge, but at a look from that quarter, expressive though instantaneous, he settled them on Mr. Bounderby's face.
"Now, what you complain of?"
asked Mr. Bounderby.
"I ha' not come here, sir,
Stephen reminded him.
to complain. I come for what I was sent for."
"What?"
repeated Mr. Bounderby, folding his arms.
"Do you people, in a general way, complain of?"
Stephen looked at him with some little irresolution for a moment, and then seemed to make up his mind.
"Sir, I were never good at showing out, though I had my share of feeling it. 'Deed, we're in a muddle, sir. Look round town, so rich as 'tis, and see number of people has been broughten into here for weave, and for card, and for piece out of living, all the same way somehows, twixt the candles and the graves. Look how we live, and where we live, and in what numbers, and by what chances, and with what sameness, and look how mills is allers a going, and how they never works us no near to any distant object, 'ceptin always death. Look how you consider us, and writes of us, and talks of us, and goes up with your deputations to Secretaries of State about us, and how you're always right, and how we're always wrong, and never had no reason in us since we were born. Look how this has grown and grown, sir, bigger and bigger, broader and broader, harder and harder, fra year to year, fra generation unto generation. Who can look on it, sir, and fairly tell a man 'tis nor a muddle?"
"Of course,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"Now perhaps you'll let the gentleman know how you would set this muddle, as you're so fond of calling it, to rights."
"I dunno, sir, I canna be expected to. 'Tis not me as should be looking for that, sir. 'Tis them as is put o'er me, and o'er all t' rest of us. What do they take upon themselves, sir, if not for to do it?"
"I'll tell you something towards it, at any rate,"
returned Bounderby.
"We will make an example of half a dozen slack bridges. We'll indict the blackguards for felony, and get 'em shift off to penal settlements."
Stephen gravely shook his head.
"Don't tell me we won't, man,"
said Bounderby, by this time blowing a hurricane.
"because we will, I tell you."
"Sir,"
returned Stephen, with the quiet confidence of absolute certainty,
"if you were to take 100 slack bridges, always there is, and all the number 10 times towards, and was to sew 'em up in separate sacks, and sink 'em in deepest ocean as were made ere ever dry land come to be, you'd leave the muddle just where it is. Mischievous strangers,"
said Stephen, with an anxious smile.
"When I were norrern, I'm sure, sin ever we were called to mind at mischievous strangers, 'tis not by them the trouble's made, sir. 'Tis not with them it commences. I ha' no favour for them. I ha' no reason to favour 'em, but 'tis hopeless and useless to dream of taking them from the trade, 'stead of taking the trade fra them. All that know about me in this room were here afore I come, and will be here when I'm gone. Put that clock aboard a ship and pack it off to Norfolk Island, and the time will go on just the same. So 'tis with Slackbridge every bit."
Reverting for a moment to his former refuge, he observed a cautionary movement of her eyes towards the door. Stepping back, he put his hand upon the lock. But he had not spoken out of his own will and desire, and he felt it in his heart a noble return for his late injurious treatment to be faithful to the last to those who had repudiated him. He stayed to finish what was in his mind.
"Sir, I canna with my little learning and my common way tell the gentleman what will better all this, though some working men of this town code above my powers, but I can tell him what will never do. The strong hand will never do it. Victory and triumph will never do it. Agreeing for to make one side unnaturally always and for ever right, and t'other side unnaturally always and for ever wrong will never, never do it. Nor yet letting alone will never do it. Let thousands upon thousands alone, all leading the like lives and all falling into like muddle, as they will be as one, and you will be as another, wi' a black unpassable world betwixt you, just as long as short a time as such like misery can last, not drawing nigh to folk with kindness and patience and cheery ways, that so draws nigh to one another in their money troubles, and so cherishes one another in their distresses with what they need themselves, like I humbly believe as no people the gentleman has seen in all his travels can beat, will never do till sun turns to ice, most of all rating 'em as so much power, and regulating 'em as if they were figures in a sumer, machines, without love and likings, without memories and inclinations, without souls to weary and souls to hope, when all goes quiet dragging on with 'em as if they'd nowt at kind, and when all goes on quiet reproaching 'em for the want of such humany feelings in their dealings with you. This'll never do, sir, till God's work is onmade."
Stephen stood with the open door in his hand, waiting to know if anything more were expected of him.
"Just stop a moment,"
said Mr. Bounderby, excessively red in the face.
"I told you, the last time you were here with your grievance, that you had better turn about and come out of that. And I also told you, if you remember, that I was up to the gold spoon look-out."
"I were not up to it, my sense, sir, I do assure you."
Now, it's clear to me
said Mr. Bounderby,
that you are one of those chaps who have always got a grievance, and you go about sowing it and raising crops. That's the business of your life, my friend."
Stephen shook his head, mutely protesting that indeed he had other business to do for his life.
"You're such a waspish, raspish, ill-conditioned chap, you see,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"that even your own union, the men who know you best, will have nothing to do with you. I never thought those fellows could be right in anything, but I tell you what, I so far go along with 'em for a novelty, that I'll have nothing to do with you either."
Stephen raised his eyes quickly to his face.
"You can finish off what you're at,"
said Mr. Bounderby, with a meaning nod,
"and then go elsewhere."
"Sir, you know weel,"
said Stephen, expressively,
"that if I cannot get work with you, I cannot get it elsewhere."
The reply was,
"What I know, and what you know, you know. I have no more to say about it."
Stephen glanced at Louisa again, but her eyes were raised to his no more. Therefore, with a sigh, and saying barely above his breath,
"Heaven help us all in this world,"
he departed. End of chapter 5. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 6. Fading Away. It was falling dark when Stephen came out of Mr. Bounderby's house. The shadows of night had gathered so fast that he did not look about him when he closed the door, but plodded straight along the street. Nothing was further from his thoughts than the curious old woman he had encountered on his previous visit to the same house, when he heard a step behind him that he knew, and turning, saw her in Rachel's company. He saw Rachel first, as he had heard her only.
"Ah, Rachel, my dear, Mrs. Thou here."
"Well, and now you are surprised to be sure, and with reason, I must say,"
the old woman returned.
"Here I am again, you see."
"But how wi' Rachel?"
said Stephen, falling into their step, walking between them, and looking from one to the other.
"Why, I come to be with this good lass pretty much as I came to be with you,"
said the old woman, cheerfully, taking the reply upon herself.
"My visiting time is later this year than usual, for I have been rather troubled with shortness of breath, and so put it off till the weather was fine and warm. For the same reason I don't make all my journey in one day, but divide it into 2 days, and get a bed to-night at the Travellers' Coffee-house down by the railroad, a nice clean house, and go back Parliamentary at 6 in the morning. Well, but what has this to do with this good lass, says you? I'm going to tell you. I've heard of Mr. Bounderby being married. I read it in the paper, where it looked grand. Oh, it looked fine. And I want to see his wife. I have never seen her yet. Now, if you'll believe me, she hasn't come out of that house since noon to-day. So, not to give her up too easily, I was waiting about a little last bit more, when I passed close to this good lass 2 or 3 times, and her face being so friendly, I spoke to her, and she spoke to me. There,"
said the old woman to Stephen.
"You can make all the rest out for yourself now, a deal shorter than I can, I dare say."
Once again Stephen had to conquer an instinctive propensity to dislike this old woman, though her manner was as honest and simple as a manner possibly could be. With a gentleness that was as natural to him as he knew it to be to Rachel, he pursued the subject that interested her in her old age.
"Well, missus,"
said he,
"I seen the lady, and she were young and handsome, with fine dark thinking eyes and a still way. Rachel, as I had ne'er seen the like on."
Young and handsome, yes.
cried the old woman, quite delighted.
As bonny as a rose. And what a happy wife.
"Aye, missus, I suppose she be,"
said Stephen, with a doubtful glance at Rachel.
Suppose she be? She must be. She's your master's wife,
returned the old woman. Stephen nodded assent.
"Though as to master,"
said he, glancing again at Rachel,
"not master any more. That all ended twixt him and me."
Have you left his work, Stephen?
asked Rachel, anxiously and quickly.
"Why, Rachel,"
he replied,
"whether I have left his work, or whether his work hath left me, comes to the same. His work and me are parted. 'Tis as well so, better, I were thinking when yo comes up with me. It would ha' brought trouble upon trouble if I'd stayed there. Haply 'tis a kindness to many that I go. Haply 'tis a kindness to mysen. Anyways, it mun be done. I mun turn my face for Coketown for time and seek a fortune dear by beginning fresh."
Where will you go, Stephen?
"I dunno tonight,"
said he, lifting his hat and smoothing his thin hair with the flat of his hand.
"but I'm not going tonight, Rachel, nor yet tomorrow. 'Tan't easy overmuch to know where to turn, but a good heart will come to me."
Herein, too, the sense of even thinking unselfishly aided him. Before he had so much as closed Mr. Bounderby's door, he had reflected that at least his being obliged to go away was good for her, as it would save her from the chance of being brought into question for not withdrawing from him. Though it would cost him a hard pang to leave her, and though he could think of no similar place in which his condemnation would not pursue him, perhaps it was almost a relief to be forced away from the endurance of the last 4 days, even to unknown difficulties and distresses. So he said, with truth,
"I'm more leetsome, Rachel, under it than I could have believed."
It was not her part to make his burden heavier. She answered with her comforting smile, and the three walked on together. Age, especially when it strives to be self-reliant and cheerful, finds much consideration among the poor. The old woman was so decent and contented, and made so light of her infirmities, though they had increased upon her since her former interview with Stephen, that they both took an interest in her. She was too sprightly to allow of their walking at a slow pace on her account, but she was very grateful to be talked to, and very willing to talk in any extent. So, when they came to their part of the town, she was more brisk and vivacious than ever.
"Come to my poor place, missus,"
said Stephen,
"and take a cup of tea. Rachel will come then, and afterwards I'll see thee safe to the travellers' lodging. 'Tis maybe long, Rachel, ere ever I have chance of thy company again."
They complied, and the three went on to the house where he lodged. When they turned into a narrow street, Stephen glanced at his window with a dread that always haunted his desolate home. But it was open as he had left it, and no one was there. The evil spirit of his life had flitted away again, months ago, and he had heard no more of her since. The only evidence of her last return now were the scantier movables in his room, and the grayer hair upon his head. He lighted a candle, set out his little tea-board, got hot water from below, and brought in small portions of tea and sugar, a loaf, and some butter from the nearest shop. The bread was new and crusty, the butter fresh, and the sugar lump, of course, in fulfilment of the standard testimony of the Coketown magnates, that these people lived like princes, sir. Rachel made the tea. So large a party necessitated the borrowing of a cup, and the visitor enjoyed it mightily. It was the first glimpse of sociality the host had had for many days. He, too, with the world a wide heath before him, enjoyed the meal, again in corroboration of the magnates, as exemplifying the utter want of calculation on the part of these people, sir.
I never thought yet, missus,
said Stephen.
o' asking thy name.
The old lady announced herself as Mrs. Pegler.
A widder, I think,
said Stephen.
Oh, many long years.
Mrs. Pegler's husband, one of the best on record, was already dead, by Mrs. Pegler's calculation, when Stephen was born.
'Twere a bad job, too, to lose so good a one,
said Stephen.
Onny children?
Mrs. Pegler's cup, rattling against her saucer as she held it, denoted some nervousness on her part.
No,
she said.
Not now, not now.
Dead, Stephen,
Rachel softly hinted.
I'm sorry I've spoken on it,
said Stephen.
I ought to had it in my mind as I might touch a sore place. I blame me sen.
While he excused himself, the old lady's cup rattled more and more.
I had a son,
she said, curiously distressed, and not by any of the usual appearances of sorrow.
And he did well, wonderfully well. But he is not to be spoken of, if you please. He is,
Putting down her cup, she moved her hands as if she would have added, by her action,
dead.
Then she said aloud,
I have lost him.
Stephen had not yet got the better of his having given the old lady pain, when his landlady came stumbling up the narrow stairs, and calling him to the door, whispered in his ear. Mrs. Pegler was by no means deaf, for she caught a word as it was uttered.
Bounderby!
she cried, in a suppressed voice, starting up from the table.
Oh, hide me! Don't let me be seen for the world! Don't let him come up till I've got away! Pray, pray!
She trembled, and was excessively agitated, getting behind Rachel, when Rachel tried to reassure her, and not seeming to know what she was about.
But hearken, Mrs. Hearken,
said Stephen, astonished.
'Tisn't Mr. Bounderby, 'tis his wife. You're not fearing of her. Yours, you gone mad about her for an hour sin.
But are you sure it's the lady and not the gentleman?
she asked, still trembling.
Certain sure.
Well then, pray don't speak to me, nor yet take any notice of me,
said the old woman.
Let me be quite to myself in this corner.
Stephen nodded, looking to Rachel for an explanation, which she was quite unable to give him, took the candle, went downstairs, and in a few moments returned, lighting Louisa into the room. She was followed by the whelp. Rachel had risen and stood apart with her shawl and bonnet in her hand, when Stephen, himself profoundly astonished by this visit, put the candle on the table. Then he too stood, with his doubled hand upon the table near it, waiting to be addressed. For the first time in her life, Louisa had come into one of the dwellings of the Coketown hands. For the first time in her life she was face to face with anything like individuality in connection with them. She knew of their existence by hundreds and by thousands. She knew what results in work a given number of them would produce in a given space of time. She knew them in crowds passing to and from their nests, like ants or beetles. But she knew from her reading infinitely more of the ways of toiling insects than of these toiling men and women. Something to be worked so much and paid so much, and there ended. Something to be infallibly settled by laws of supply and demand. Something that blundered against these laws, and floundered into difficulty. Something that was a little pinched when wheat was dear, and overate itself when wheat was cheap. Something that increased at such a rate of percentage, and yielded such another percentage of crime, and such another percentage of pauperism. Something wholesale, of which vast fortunes were made. Something that occasionally rose like a sea, and did some harm and waste, chiefly to itself, and fell again. This she knew the Coketown hands to be. But she had scarcely thought more of separating them into units than of separating the sea itself into its component drops. She stood for some moments looking round the room. From the few chairs, the few books, the common prints, and the bed, she glanced to the two women and to Stephen.
I have come to speak to you in consequence of what passed just now. I should like to be serviceable to you, if you will let me. Is this your wife?
Rachel raised her eyes, and they sufficiently answered no, and dropped again.
I remember,
said Louisa, reddening at her mistake.
I recollect now to have heard your domestic misfortunes spoken of, though I was not attending to the particulars at the time. It was not my meaning to ask a question that would give pain to any one here. If I should ask any other question that may happen to have that result, give me credit, if you please, for being in ignorance how to speak to you as I ought.
As Stephen had but a little while ago instinctively addressed himself to her, so she now instinctively addressed herself to Rachel. Her manner was short and abrupt, yet faltering and timid.
He has told you what has passed between himself and my husband. You would be his first resource, I think.
I have heard the end of it, young lady,
said Rachel.
Did I understand that, being rejected by one employer, he would probably be rejected by all? I thought he said as much.
The chances are very small, young lady, next to nothing, for a man who gets a bad name among them.
What shall I understand that you mean by a bad name?
The name of being troublesome.
Then by the prejudices of his own class, and by the prejudices of the other, he is sacrificed alike? Are the two so deeply separated in this town, that there is no place whatever for an honest workman between them?
Rachel shook her head in silence.
He fell into suspicion,
said Louisa,
with his fellow weavers, because he had made a promise not to be one of them. I think it must have been to you that he made that promise. Might I ask you why he made it?
Rachel burst into tears.
I didn't seek it of him, poor lad. I prayed him to avoid trouble for his own good, little thinking he'd come to it through me. But I know he'd die 100 deaths ere ever he'd break his word. I know that of him well.
Stephen had remained quietly attentive, in his usual thoughtful attitude, with his hand at his chin. He now spoke, in a voice rather less steady than usual.
No one excepting myself can ever know what honour and what love and what respect I bear to Rachel, or with what cause. When I passed that promise I towed her true. She were th' angel of my life. 'Twere a solemn promise. 'Tis gone from me for ever.
Louisa turned her head to him, and bent it with a deference that was new to her. She looked from him to Rachel, and her features softened.
What will you do?
she asked him, and her voice had softened too.
Weel, ma'am,
said Stephen, making the best of it, with a smile.
When I have finished off, I mun quit this part and try another. Fortnate to misfortnate a man can but try. There's nowt to be done without trying, 'cept laying down and dying.
How will you travel?
Afoot, me kind lady, afoot.
Louisa coloured, and a purse appeared in her hand. The rustling of a bank-note was audible, as she unfolded one and laid it on the table.
Rachel, will you tell him, for you know how, without offence, that this is freely his to help him on his way? Will you entreat him to take it?
I cannot do that, young lady,
she answered, turning her head aside.
Bless you for thinking of the poor lad with such tenderness, but 'tis for him to know his heart, and what is right according to it.
Louisa looked in part incredulous, in part frightened, in part overcome with quick sympathy, when this man of so much self-command, who had been so plain and steady through the late interview, lost his composure in a moment, and now stood with his hand before his face. She stretched out hers as if she would have touched him, then checked herself and remained still.
Nor e'en Rachel,
said Stephen, when he stood again with his face uncovered,
could make such a kind offering wi' any words kinder. To show that I'm not a man without reason and gratitude, I'll take £2. I'll borrow for t' pay back. 'Twill be the sweetest work as ever I ha' done. That puts it in my power to acknowledge once more my lasting thankfulness for this present action."
She was fain to take up the note again, and to substitute the much smaller sum he had named. He was neither courtly, nor handsome, nor picturesque in any respect, and yet his manner of accepting it, and of expressing his thanks without more words, had a grace in it that Lord Chesterfield could not have taught his son in a century. Tom had sat upon the bed, swinging one leg, and sucking his walking-stick with sufficient unconcern, until the visit had attained this stage. Seeing his sister ready to depart, he got up, rather hurriedly, and put in a word.
"Just wait a moment, Lou. Before we go, I should like to speak to him a moment. Something comes into my head. If you'll step out on the stairs, Blackpool, I'll mention it. Never mind the light, man."
Tom was remarkably impatient of his moving towards the cupboard to get one.
"You don't want a light."
Stephen followed him out, and Tom closed the room door and held the lock in his hand.
"I say,"
he whispered,
"I think I can do a good turn. Don't ask me what it is, because it may not come to anything. But there's no harm in my trying."
His breath fell like a flame of fire on Stephen's ear, it was so hot.
"That was our light porter at the bank,"
said Tom,
"who brought you the message tonight. I call him our light porter because I belong to the bank too."
Stephen thought,
"What a hurry he is in."
He spoke so confusedly.
"Well,"
said Tom.
"now look here. When are you off?"
"Today's Monday."
replied Stephen, considering.
"Why, sir, Friday or Saturday nigh about."
"Friday or Saturday,"
said Tom.
"Now, look here. I'm not sure that I can do you the good turn I want to do you. That's my sister, you know, in your room. But if I may be able to, and if I should not be able to, there's no harm done. So I tell you what. You know our light porter again?"
"Yes, sir,"
said Stephen.
"Very well,"
returned Tom.
"When you leave work of a night, between this and your going away, just hang about the bank an hour or so, will you? Don't take on as if you meant anything, if he should see you hanging about there, because I shan't put him up to speak to you, unless I find I can do you the service I want to do you. In that case he'll have a note or a message for you, but not else. Now, look here. You are sure you understand?"
He had wormed a finger in the darkness through a buttonhole of Stephen's coat, and was screwing that corner of the garment tied up round and round, in an extraordinary manner.
"I understand, sir,"
said Stephen.
"Now, look here,"
repeated Tom.
"be sure you don't make any mistake then, and don't forget. I shall tell my sister as we go home what I have in view, and she'll approve, I know. Now look here. You're all right, are you? You understand all about it? Very well then. Come along, Lou."
He pushed the door open as he called to her, but did not return into the room, or wait to be lighted down the narrow stairs. He was at the bottom when she began to descend, and was in the street before she could take his arm. Mrs. Pegler remained in her corner until the brother and sister were gone, and until Stephen came back with the candle in his hand. She was in a state of inexpressible admiration of Mrs. Bounderby, and, like an unaccountable old woman, wept,
"Because she was such a pretty dear."
Yet Mrs. Pegler was so flurried, lest the object of her admiration should return by chance, or anybody else should come, that her cheerfulness was ended for that night. It was late, too, to people who rose early and worked hard. Therefore the party broke up, and Stephen and Rachel escorted their mysterious acquaintance to the door of the travellers' coffee-house, where they parted from her. They walked back together to the corner of the street where Rachel lived, and as they drew nearer and nearer to it, silence crept upon them. When they came back to the dark corner where their unfrequent meetings always ended, they stopped, still silent, as if both were afraid to speak.
"I shall strive to see thee again, Rachel, afore I go, But if not,
Thou wilt not, Stephen, I know. 'Tis better that we make up our minds to be open with one another.
that's always right. 'Tis bolder and better. I have been thinking then, Rachel, that as 'tis but a day or two that remains, 'twere better for thee, my dear, not to be seen with me. Might bring thee into trouble for no good.
'Tis not for that, Stephen, that I mind. But thou know'st our old agreement. 'Tis for that.
Well, well,
said he.
'tis better anyways.
Thou'lt write to me and tell me all that happens, Stephen.
Yes, what can I say now but heaven be with thee, heaven bless thee, heaven thank thee and reward thee.
May it bless thee, Stephen, too, in all thy wanderings, and send thee peace and rest at last.
I told thee, my dear,
said Stephen Blackpool,
that night that I would never see or think of anything that angered me, but thou so much better than me should be beside it. Thou art beside it now. Thou makes me see it with a better eye. Bless thee. Good night. Good-bye.
It was but a hurried parting in a common street, yet it was a sacred remembrance to these two common people. Utilitarian economists, skeletons of schoolmasters, commissioners of fact, genteel and used-up infidels, gabblers of many little dog's-eared creeds, the poor you will have always with you. Cultivate in them, while there is yet time, the utmost graces of the fancies and affections, to adorn their lives, so much in need of ornament. Or in the day of your triumph, when romance is utterly driven out of their souls, and they and a bare existence stand face to face, reality will take a wolfish turn, and make an end of you. Stephen worked the next day and the next, uncheered by a word from any one, and shunned in all his comings and goings as before. At the end of the second day he saw land. At the end of the third his loom stood empty. He had overstayed his hour in the street outside the bank on each of the 2 first evenings, and nothing had happened there, good or bad. That he might not be remiss in his part of the engagement, he resolved to wait full 2 hours on this third and last night. There was the lady who had once kept Mr. Bounderby's house, sitting at the first-floor window as he had seen her before, and there was the light porter, sometimes talking with her there, and sometimes looking over the blind below which had bank upon it, and sometimes coming to the door and standing on the steps for a breath of air. When he first came out, Stephen thought he might be looking for him, and passed near. But the light porter only cast his winking eyes upon him slightly, and said nothing. 2 hours were a long stretch of lounging about, after a long day's labour. Stephen sat upon the step of a door, leaned against a wall under an archway, strolled up and down, listened for the church clock, stopped and watched children playing in the street. Some purpose or other is so natural to every one, that a mere loiterer always looks and feels remarkable. When the first hour was out, Stephen even began to have an uncomfortable sensation upon him of being for the time a disreputable character. Then came the lamplighter, and 2 lengthening lines of light, all down the long perspective of the street, until they were blended and lost in the distance. Mrs. Sparsit closed the first-floor window, drew down the blind, and went upstairs. Presently a light went upstairs after her, passing first the fanlight of the door, and afterwards the 2 staircase windows, on its way up. By and by one corner of the second-floor blind was disturbed, as if Mrs. Sparsit's eye were there. Also the other corner, as if the light porter's eye were on that side. Still no communication was made to Stephen. Much relieved when the 2 hours were at last accomplished, he went away at a quick pace, as a recompense for so much loitering. He had only to take leave of his landlady, and lie down on his temporary bed upon the floor, for his bundle was made up for to-morrow, and all was arranged for his departure. He meant to be clear of the town very early, before the hands were in the streets. It was barely daybreak when, with a parting look round his room, mournfully wondering whether he should ever see it again, he went out. The town was as entirely deserted as if the inhabitants had abandoned it, rather than hold communication with him. Everything looked wan at that hour. Even the coming sun made but a pale waste in the sky, like a sad sea. By the place where Rachel lived, though it was not in his way, by the red brick streets, by the great silent factories, not trembling yet, by the railway, where the danger lights were waning in the strengthening day, by the railway's crazy neighborhood, half pulled down and half built up, by scattered red brick villas, where the besmoked evergreens were sprinkled with a dirty powder, like untidy snuff-takers, by cold dust paths and many varieties of ugliness, Stephen got to the top of the hill and looked back. Day was shining radiantly upon the town then, and the bells were going for the morning work. Domestic fires were not yet lighted, and the high chimneys had the sky to themselves. Puffing out their poisonous volumes, they would not be long in hiding it. But for half an hour some of the many windows were golden, which showed the Coketown people a sun eternally in eclipse through a medium of smoked glass. So strange to turn from the chimneys to the birds, so strange to have the road dust on his feet instead of the coal grit, so strange to have lived to his time of life, and yet to be beginning like a boy this summer morning. With these musings in his mind, and his bundle under his arm, Stephen took his attentive face along the high road, and the trees arched over him, whispering that he left a true and loving heart behind. End of chapter 6. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 7. Gunpowder. Mr. James Harthouse, going in for his adopted party, soon began to score. With the aid of a little more coaching for the political sages, a little more genteel listlessness for the general society, and a tolerable management of the assumed honesty in dishonesty, most effective and most patronized by the polite deadly sins, he speedily came to be considered of much promise. The not being troubled with earnestness was a grand point in his favour, enabling him to take to the hard fact fellows with as good a grace as if he had been born one of the tribe, and to throw all other tribes overboard as conscious hypocrites.
Whom none of us believe, my dear Mrs. Bounderby, and who do not believe themselves. The only difference between us and the professors of virtue, or benevolence, or philanthropy, never mind the name, is, that we know it is all meaningless, and say so, while they know it equally, and will never say so.
Why should she be shocked or warned by this reiteration? It was not so unlike her father's principles and her early training that it need startle her. Where was the great difference between the two schools, when each chained her down to material realities, and inspired her with no faith in anything else? What was there in her soul for James Harthouse to destroy, which Thomas Gradgrind had nurtured there in its state of innocence? It was even the worse for her at this pass that in her mind, implanted there before her eminently practical father began to form it, a struggling disposition to believe in a wider and nobler humanity than she had ever heard of, constantly strove with doubts and resentments, with doubts because the aspiration had been so laid waste in her youth, with resentments because of the wrong that had been done her, if it were indeed a whisper of the truth. Upon a nature long accustomed to self-suppression, thus torn and divided, the Harthouse philosophy came as a relief and justification. Everything being hollow and worthless, she had missed nothing and sacrificed nothing. What did it matter, she had said to her father when he proposed her husband. What did it matter, she said still. With a scornful self-reliance she asked herself, what did anything matter, and went on. Towards what? Step by step, onward and downward, towards some end, yet so gradually that she believed herself to remain motionless. As to Mr. Harthouse, whither he tended, he neither considered nor cared. He had no particular design or plan before him. No energetic wickedness ruffled his lassitude. He was as much amused and interested at present as it became so fine a gentleman to be, perhaps even more than it would have been consistent with his reputation to confess. Soon after his arrival, he languidly wrote to his brother, the honourable and jocular member, that the Bounderbys were great fun, and further, that the female Bounderby, instead of being the Gorgon he had expected, was young, and remarkably pretty. After that he wrote no more about them, and devoted his leisure chiefly to their house. He was very often in their house, in his flittings and visitings about the Coketown district, and was much encouraged by Mr. Bounderby. It was quite in Mr. Bounderby's gusty way to boast to all his world that he didn't care about your highly connected people, but that if his wife, Tom Gradgrind's daughter, did, she was welcome to their company. Mr. James Harthouse began to think that it would be a new sensation if the face which changed so beautifully for the whelp would change for him. He was quick enough to observe, he had a good memory, and did not forget a word of the brother's revelations. He interwove them with everything he saw of the sister, and he began to understand her. To be sure, the better and profounder part of her character was not within his scope of perception, for in natures, as in seas, depth answers unto depth, but he soon began to read the rest with a student's eye. Mr. Bounderby had taken possession of a house and grounds about 15 miles from the town, and accessible, within a mile or two, by a railway striding on many arches over a wild country, undermined by deserted coal-shafts, and spotted at night by fires and black shapes of stationary engines at pits' mouths. This country, gradually softening towards the neighbourhood of Mr. Bounderby's retreat, there mellowed into a rustic landscape, golden with heath, and snowy with hawthorn in the spring of the year, and tremulous with leaves and their shadows all the summer-time. The bank had foreclosed a mortgage effected on the property, thus pleasantly situated, by one of the Coketown magnates, who, in his determination to make a shorter cut than usual to an enormous fortune, over-speculated himself by about £200,000. These accidents did sometimes happen in the best regulated families of Coketown, but the bankrupts had no connection whatever with the improvident classes. It afforded Mr. Bounderby supreme satisfaction to install himself in this snug little estate, and with demonstrative humility to grow cabbages in the flower-garden. He delighted to live, barrack fashion, among the elegant furniture, and he bullied the very pictures with his origin.
"Why, sir,"
he would say to a visitor,
"I'm told that Nickits,
the late owner,
gave £700 for that sea-beach. Now, to be plain with you, if I ever, in the whole course of my life, take 7 looks at it, at £100 a look, it'll be as much as I shall do. No, by George, I don't forget that I am Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. For years upon years, the only pictures in my possession, all that I could have got into my possession by any means, unless I stole them, were the engravings of a man shaving himself in a boot, on the blacking bottles that I was overjoyed to use in cleaning boots with, and that I sold when they were empty for a farthing apiece, and glad to get it.
Then he would address Mr. Harthouse in the same style.
Harthouse, you have a couple of horses down here. Bring half a dozen more if you like, and we'll find room for 'em. There's stabling in this place for a dozen horses, and unless Nickits is belied, he kept the full number. A round dozen of 'em, sir. When that man was a boy, he went to Westminster School. Went to Westminster School as a king's scholar when I was principally living on garbage and sleeping in market-baskets. Why, if I wanted to keep a dozen horses, which I don't, for one's good enough for me, I couldn't bear to see 'em in their stalls here, and think what my own lodging used to be. I couldn't look at 'em, sir, and not order 'em out. Yet so things come round. You see this place? You know what sort of place it is? You're aware that there's not a completer place of its size in this kingdom or elsewhere, I don't care where, and here, got into the middle of it, like a maggot in a nut, is Josiah Bounderby, while Nickits, as a man came into my office and told me yesterday, Nickits, who used to act in Latin in the Westminster School plays, with the chief justices and nobility of this country applauding him till they were black in the face, is drivelling at this minute. Drivelling, sir, in a 5th floor up a narrow, dark back street in Antwerp.
It was among the leafy shadows of this retirement, in the long sultry summer days, that Mr. Harthouse began to prove the face which had set him wondering when he first saw it, and to try if it would change for him.
Mrs. Bounderby, I deem it a most fortunate accident that I find you alone here. I have for some time had a particular wish to speak to you.
It was not by any wonderful accident that he found her, the time of day being that at which she was always alone, and the place being her favourite resort. It was an opening in a dark wood, where some felled trees lay, and where she would sit watching the fallen leaves of last year, as she had watched the falling ashes at home. He sat down beside her, with a glance at her face.
Your brother, my young friend Tom.
Her colour brightened, and she turned to him with a look of interest.
I never in my life,
he thought,
saw anything so remarkable and so captivating as the lighting of those features.
His face betrayed his thoughts, perhaps without betraying him, for it might have been according to its instructions so to do.
Pardon me, the expression of your sisterly interest is so beautiful. Tom should be so proud of it. I know this is inexcusable, but I am so compelled to admire.
Being so impulsive,
she said composedly.
Mrs. Bounderby, no. You know I make no pretence with you. You know I am a sordid piece of human nature, ready to sell myself at any time, for any reasonable sum, and altogether incapable of any Arcadian proceeding whatever.
I am waiting,
she returned,
for your further reference to my brother.
You are rigid with me, and I deserve it. I am as worthless a dog as you will find, except that I am not false, not false. But you surprised and startled me from my subject, which was your brother. I have an interest in him.
Have you an interest in anything, Mr. Harthouse?
she asked, half incredulously and half gratefully.
If you had asked me when I first came here, I should have said no. I must say now, even at the hazard of appearing to make pretence, and of justly awakening your incredulity, yes.
She made a slight movement, as if she were trying to speak, but could not find voice. At length she said,
Mr. Harthouse, I give you credit for being interested in my brother.
Thank you. I claim to deserve it. You know how little I do claim, but I will go that length. You have done so much for him, you are so fond of him, your whole life, Mrs. Bounderby, expresses such charming self-forgetfulness on his account. Pardon me again, I am running wide of the subject. I am interested in him for his own sake."
She made the slightest action possible, as if she would have risen in a hurry and gone away. He had turned the course of what he said at that instant, and she remained.
"Mrs. Bounderby,"
he resumed, in a lighter manner, and yet with a show of effort in assuming it, which was even more expressive than the manner he dismissed.
"it is no irrevocable offence in a young fellow of your brother's years if he is heedless, inconsiderate, and expensive. A little dissipated, in the common phrase. Is he?"
"Yes."
"Allow me to be frank. Do you think he games at all?"
"I think he makes bets."
Mr. Harthouse waiting, as if that were not her whole answer, she added,
"I know he does."
"Of course he loses?"
"Yes."
"Everybody does lose who bets. May I hint at the probability of your sometimes supplying him with money for these purposes?"
She sat looking down, but at this question raised her eyes searchingly, and a little resentfully.
"Acquit me of impertinent curiosity, my dear Mrs. Bounderby. I think Tom may be gradually falling into trouble, and I wish to stretch out a helping hand to him from the depths of my wicked experience. Shall I say again, for his sake? Is that necessary?"
She seemed to try to answer, but nothing came of it.
"Candidly to confess everything that has occurred to me,"
said James Harthouse, again gliding with the same appearance of effort into his more airy manner,
"I will confide to you my doubt whether he has had many advantages; whether, forgive my plainness, whether any great amount of confidence is likely to have been established between himself and his most worthy father."
"I do not,"
said Louisa, flushing with her own great remembrance in that wise,
"think it likely."
"Or between himself and, I may trust to your perfect understanding of my meaning, I am sure, and his highly esteemed brother-in-law."
She flushed deeper and deeper, and was burning red when she replied in a fainter voice,
"I do not think that likely either."
"Mrs. Bounderby,"
said Harthouse, after a short silence,
"may there be a better confidence between yourself and me? Tom has borrowed a considerable sum of you."
"You will understand, Mr. Harthouse,"
she returned, after some indecision. She had been more or less uncertain and troubled throughout the conversation, and yet had in the main preserved her self-contained manner.
"You will understand that if I tell you what you press to know, it is not by way of complaint or regret. I would never complain of anything, and what I have done I do not in the least regret."
"So spirited, too,"
thought James Harthouse.
When I married, I found that my brother was even at that time heavily in debt. Heavily for him, I mean. Heavily enough to oblige me to sell some trinkets. They were no sacrifice. I sold them very willingly. I attached no value to them. They were quite worthless to me.
Either she saw in his face that he knew, or she only feared in her conscience that he knew that she spoke of some of her husband's gifts. She stopped and reddened again. If he had not known it before, he would have known it then, though he had been a much duller man than he was.
Since then I have given my brother, at various times, what money I could spare, in short, what money I have had. Confiding in you at all, on the faith of the interest you profess for him, I will not do so by halves. Since you have been in the habit of visiting here, he has wanted in one sum as much as £100. I have not been able to give it to him. I have felt uneasy for the consequences of his being so involved, but I have kept these secrets until now, when I trust them to your honour. I have held no confidence with any one, because you anticipated my reason just now."
She abruptly broke off. He was a ready man, and he saw and seized an opportunity here of presenting her own image to her, slightly disguised as her brother.
"Mrs. Bounderby, though a graceless person, of the world worldly, I feel the utmost interest, I assure you, in what you tell me. I cannot possibly be hard upon your brother. I understand and share the wise consideration with which you regard his errors. With all possible respect both for Mr. Gradgrind and for Mr. Bounderby, I think I perceive that he has not been fortunate in his training. Bred at a disadvantage towards the society in which he has his part to play, he rushes into these extremes for himself, from opposite extremes that have long been forced, with the very best intentions, we have no doubt, upon him. Mr. Bounderby's fine bluff English independence, though a most charming characteristic, does not, as we have agreed, invite confidence. If I might venture to remark that it is the least in the world deficient in that delicacy to which a youth mistaken, a character misconceived, and abilities misdirected would turn to relief and guidance, I should express what it presents to my own view.
As she sat looking straight before her, across the changing lights, upon the grass into the darkness of the wood beyond, he saw in her face her application of his very distinctly uttered words.
"All allowance,"
he continued,
"must be made. I have one great fault to find with Tom, however, which I cannot forgive, and for which I take him heavily to account."
Louisa turned her eyes to his face, and asked him what fault was that.
"Perhaps,"
he returned,
"I have said enough. Perhaps it would have been better, on the whole, if no allusion to it had escaped me."
You alarm me, Mr. Harthouse. Pray let me know it.
To relieve you from needless apprehension, and as this confidence regarding your brother, which I prize, I am sure, above all possible things, has been established between us, I obey. I cannot forgive him for not being more sensible in every word, look, and act of his life, of the affection of his best friend, of the devotion of his best friend, of her unselfishness, of her sacrifice. The return he makes her, within my observation, is a very poor one. What she has done for him demands his constant love and gratitude, not his ill humour and caprice. Careless fellow as I am not so indifferent, Mrs. Bounderby, as to be regardless of this vice in your brother, or inclined to consider it a venial offence."
The wood floated before her, for her eyes were suffused with tears. They rose from a deep well, long concealed, and her heart was filled with acute pain that found no relief in them.
In a word, it is to correct your brother in this, Mrs. Bounderby, that I must aspire. My better knowledge of his circumstances, and my direction and advice in extricating them, rather valuable, I hope, as coming from a scapegrace on a much larger scale, will give me some influence over him, and all I gain I shall certainly use towards this end. I have said enough, and more than enough. I seem to be protesting that I am a sort of good fellow, when, upon my honour, I have not the least intention to make any protestation to that effect, and openly announce that I am nothing of the sort. Yonder, among the trees,"
he added, having lifted up his eyes and looked about, for he had watched her closely until now,
"is your brother himself, no doubt just come down. As he seems to be loitering in this direction, it may be as well, perhaps, to walk towards him, and throw ourselves in his way. He has been very silent and doleful of late. Perhaps his brotherly conscience is touched, if there are such things as consciences, though, upon my honour, I hear of them much too often to believe in them."
He assisted her to rise, and she took his arm, and they advanced to meet the whelp. He was idly beating the branches as he lounged along, or he stooped viciously to rip the moss from the trees with his stick. He was startled when they came upon him while he was engaged in this latter pastime, and his colour changed.
Hello.
He stammered.
I didn't know you were here.
"Whose name, Tom?"
said Mr. Harthouse, putting his hand upon his shoulder and turning him, so that they all three walked towards the house together.
"Have you been carving on the trees?"
Whose name?
returned Tom.
Oh, you mean what girl's name?
"You have a suspicious appearance of inscribing some fair creatures on the bark, Tom."
Not much of that, Mr. Harthouse. Unless some fair creature with a slashing fortune at her own disposal would take a fancy to me. Or she might be as ugly as she was rich, without any fear of losing me. I'd carve her name as often as she liked.
"I'm afraid you are mercenary, Tom."
Mercenary,
repeated Tom.
who is not mercenary? Ask my sister.
Have you so proved it to be a failing of mine, Tom?
said Louisa, showing no other sense of his discontent and ill nature.
You know whether the cap fits you, Lou?
Returned her brother sulkily.
If it does, you can wear it.
Tom is misanthropical to-day, as all bored people are, now and then,
said Mr. Harthouse.
Don't believe him, Mrs. Bounderby. He knows much better. I shall disclose some of his opinions of you, privately expressed to me, unless he relents a little.
At all events, Mr. Harthouse,
said Tom, softening in his admiration of his patron, but shaking his head sullenly too.
You can't tell her that I ever praised her for being mercenary. I may have praised her for being the contrary, and I should do it again, if I had as good reason. However, never mind this now. It's not very interesting to you, and I am sick of the subject.
They walked on to the house, where Louisa quitted her visitor's arm and went in. He stood looking after her as she ascended the steps and passed into the shadow of the door, then put his hand upon her brother's shoulder again, and invited him, with a confidential nod, to a walk in the garden.
Tom, my fine fellow, I want to have a word with you.
They had stopped among a disorder of roses. It was part of Mr. Bounderby's humility to keep Nickits's roses on a reduced scale, and Tom sat down on a terrace parapet, plucking buds and picking them to pieces, while his powerful familiar stood over him, with a foot upon the parapet, and his figure easily resting on the arm supported by that knee. They were just visible from her window. Perhaps she saw them.
Tom, what's the matter?
Oh, Mr. Harthouse,
said Tom with a groan.
I am hard up and bothered out of my life.
My good fellow, so am I.
You,
returned Tom.
You are the picture of independence, Mr. Harthouse. I am in a horrible mess. You have no idea what a state I've got myself into. What a state my sister might have got me out of, if she would only have done it.
He took to biting the rosebuds now, and tearing them away from his teeth with a hand that trembled like an infirm old man's. And after one exceedingly observant look at him, his companion relapsed into his lightest air.
Tom, you are inconsiderate. You expect too much of your sister. You have had money of her, you dog. You know you have.
Well, Mr. Harthouse, I know I have. How else was I to get it? Here's old Bounderby always boasting that at my age he lived upon 2d. a month or something that sort. Here's my father drawing what he calls a line and tying me down to it from a baby, neck and heels. Here's my mother who never has anything of her own except her complaints. What is a fellow to do for money, and where am I to look for it, if not to my sister?
He was almost crying, and scattered the buds about by dozens. Mr. Harthouse took him persuasively by the coat.
But, my dear Tom, if your sister has not got it—
Not got it, Mr. Harthouse? I don't say she has got it. I may have wanted more than she was likely to have got, but then she ought to get it. She could get it. It's of no use pretending to make a secret of matters now, after what I've told you already. You know she didn't marry old Bounderby for her own sake, or for his sake, but for my sake. Then why doesn't she get what I want out of him for my sake? She's not obliged to say what she's going to do with it. She's sharp enough. She could manage to coax it out of him if she chose. Then why doesn't she choose, when I tell her of what consequence it is? But no, there she sits in his company like a stone, instead of making herself agreeable and getting it easily. I don't know what you may call this, but I call it unnatural conduct.
There was a piece of ornamental water immediately below the parapet, on the other side, into which Mr. James Harthouse had a very strong inclination to pitch Mr. Thomas Gradgrind, Junior, as the injured men of Coketown threatened to pitch their property into the Atlantic. But he preserved his easy attitude, and nothing more solid went over the stone balustrades than the accumulated rosebuds now floating about, a little surface island.
My dear Tom,
said Harthouse,
let me try to be your banker.
For God's sake,
replied Tom suddenly,
don't talk about bankers.
and very white he looked in contrast with the roses, very white. Mr. Harthouse, as a thoroughly well-bred man, accustomed to the best society, was not to be surprised. He could as soon have been affected, but he raised his eyelids a little more, as if they were lifted by a feeble touch of wonder. Albeit it was as much against the precepts of his school to wonder, as it was against the doctrines of the Gradgrind college.
What is the present need, Tom? 3 figures? Out with them, see what they are.
Mr. Harthouse,
returned Tom, now actually crying, and his tears were better than his injuries, however pitiful a figure he made.
It's too late. The money is of no use to me at present. I should have had it before to be of use to me. But I am very much obliged to you. You're a true friend.
A true friend!
Whelp, whelp,
thought Mr. Harthouse lazily.
What an ass you are!
And I take your offer as a great kindness,
said Tom, grasping his hand.
As a great kindness, Mr. Harthouse.
Well,
returned the other,
it may be of more use by and by, and, my good fellow, if you will open your bedevilments to me, when they come thick upon you, I can show you better ways out of them than you can find for yourself.
Thank you,
said Tom, shaking his head dismally and chewing rosebuds.
I wish I had known you sooner, Mr. Harthouse.
Now you see, Tom,
said Mr. Harthouse in conclusion, himself tossing over a rose or two as a contribution to the island, which was always drifting to the wall, as if it wanted to become a part of the mainland.
every man is selfish in everything he does, and I am exactly like the rest of my fellow creatures. I am desperately intent,
the languor of his desperation becoming quite tropical,
on your softening towards your sister, which you ought to do, and on your being a more loving and agreeable sort of brother, which you ought to be.
I will be, Mr. Harthouse.
No time like the present, Tom. Begin at once.
Certainly I will, and my sister Lou shall say so.
Having made which bargain, Tom?
said Harthouse, clapping him on the shoulder again, with an air which left him at liberty to infer, as he did, poor fool, that this condition was imposed upon him in merely careless good nature to lessen his sense of obligation.
We will tear ourselves asunder until dinner-time.
When Tom appeared before dinner, though his mind seemed heavy enough, his body was on the alert, and he appeared before Mr. Bounderby came in.
I didn't mean to be cross, Lou,
he said, giving her his hand and kissing her.
I know you are fond of me, and you know I am fond of you.
After this there was a smile upon Louisa's face that day, for someone else. Alas, for someone else.
So much the less is the whelp the only creature she cares for,
thought James Harthouse, reversing the reflection of his first day's knowledge of her pretty face.
So much the less, so much the less.
End of chapter 7. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8. Explosion. The next morning was too bright a morning for sleep, and James Harthouse rose early, and sat in the pleasant bay window of his dressing-room, smoking the rare tobacco that had had so wholesome an influence on his young friend. Reposing in the sunlight, with the fragrance of his Eastern pipe about him, and the dreamy smoke vanishing into the air, so rich and soft with summer odours, he reckoned up his advantages as an idle winner might count his gains. He was not at all bored for the time, and could give his mind to it. He had established a confidence with her, from which her husband was excluded. He had established a confidence with her that absolutely turned upon her indifference towards her husband, and the absence, now and at all times, of any congeniality between them. He had artfully but plainly assured her that he knew her heart in its last most delicate recesses. He had come so near to her through its tenderest sentiment. He had associated himself with that feeling, and the barrier behind which she lived had melted away. All very odd, and very satisfactory. And yet he had not, even now, any earnest wickedness of purpose in him. Publicly and privately it were much better for the age in which he lived that he and the legion of whom he was one were designedly bad, than indifferent and purposeless. It is the drifting icebergs setting with any current anywhere that wreck the ships. When the devil goeth about like a roaring lion, he goeth about in a shape by which few but savages and hunters are attracted. But when he is trimmed, smoothed, and varnished, according to the mode, when he is aweary of vice and aweary of virtue, used up as to brimstone, and used up as to bliss, then, whether he take to the serving out of red tape, or to the kindling of red fire, he is the very devil. So James Harthouse reclined in the window, indolently smoking, and reckoning up the steps he had taken on the road by which he happened to be travelling. The end to which it led was before him, pretty plainly, but he troubled himself with no calculations about it. What will be, will be. As he had rather a long ride to take that day, for there was a public occasion to do at some distance, which afforded a tolerable opportunity of going in for the Gradgrind men, he dressed early and went down to breakfast. He was anxious to see if she had relapsed since the previous evening. No, it resumed where he had left off. There was a look of interest for him again. He got through the day as much or as little to his own satisfaction as was to be expected under the fatiguing circumstances, and came riding back at 6 o'clock. There was a sweep of some half-mile between the lodge and the house, and he was riding along at a foot-pace over the smooth gravel, one's knickets's, when Mr. Bounderby burst out of the shrubbery with such violence as to make his horse shy across the road.
"Harthouse!"
cried Mr. Bounderby.
"Have you heard?"
Heard what?
said Harthouse, soothing his horse, and inwardly favouring Mr. Bounderby with no good wishes.
"Then you haven't heard?"
I have heard you, and so has this brute. I have heard nothing else.
Mr. Bounderby, red and hot, planted himself in the centre of the path before the horse's head, to explode his bombshell with more effect.
"The bank's robbed."
You don't mean it.
"Robbed last night, sir. Robbed in an extraordinary manner. Robbed with a false key."
Of much?
Mr. Bounderby, in his desire to make the most of it, really seemed mortified by being obliged to reply.
"Why, no, not of very much, but it might have been."
Of how much?
"Oh, a sum, if you stick to a sum, not more than £150.
said Mr. Bounderby, with impatience.
"But it's not the sum, it's the fact. It's the fact of the bank being robbed. That's the important circumstance. I'm surprised you don't see it."
My dear Bounderby,
said James, dismounting, and giving his bridle to his servant,
I do see it, and as am overcome as you can possibly desire me to be by the spectacle afforded to my mental view. Nevertheless, I may be allowed, I hope, to congratulate you, which I do with all my soul, I assure you, on your not having sustained a greater loss."
"Thank ye,"
replied Bounderby, in a short, ungracious manner.
"but I tell you what, it might have been £20,000.
I suppose it might.
"Suppose it might? By the Lord, you may suppose so. By George!"
said Mr. Bounderby, with sundry menacing nods and shakes of his head.
It might have been twice 20. There's no knowing what it would have been or it wouldn't have been as it was, but for the feller's being disturbed."
Louisa had come up now, and Mrs. Sparsit and Bitzer.
Here's Tom Gradgrind's daughter knows pretty well what it might have been if you don't,"
blustered Bounderby.
"Dropped, sir, as if she was shot when I told her. Never knew her to do such a thing before. Does her credit under the circumstances, in my opinion."
She still looked faint and pale. James Harthouse begged her to take his arm, and as they moved on very slowly, asked her how the robbery had been committed.
"Why, I'm going to tell you,"
said Bounderby, irritably giving his arm to Mrs. Sparsit.
"If you hadn't been so mighty particular about the sum, I should have begun to tell you before. You know this lady, for she is a lady, Mrs. Sparsit?"
I have already had the honour.
"Very well, and this young man Bitzer, you saw him too on the same occasion?"
Mr. Harthouse inclined his head in assent, and Bitzer knuckled his forehead.
"Very well. They live at the bank. You know they live at the bank, perhaps? Very well. Yesterday afternoon, at the close of business hours, everything was put away as usual. In the iron room that this young fellow sleeps outside of, there was never mind how much. In the little safe in young Tom's closet, the safe used for petty purposes, there was £150 odd.
154,701,
said Bitzer.
"Come,"
retorted Bounderby, stopping to wheel round upon him.
"let's have none of your interruptions. It's bad enough to be robbed while you're snoring because you're too comfortable, without being put right with your 471s. I didn't snore myself when I was at your age, let me tell you. I hadn't victuals enough to snore. And I didn't 471. Not if I knew it."
Bitzer knuckled his forehead again, in a sneaking manner, and seemed at once particularly impressed and depressed by the instance last given of Mr. Bounderby's moral abstinence.
£150 odd,
resumed Mr. Bounderby.
"That sum of money young Tom locked in his safe. Not a very strong safe, but that's no matter now. Everything was left all right. Some time in the night, while this young fellow snored— Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am, you say you have heard him snore?"
"Sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit,
"I cannot say that I have heard him precisely snore, and therefore must not make that statement. But on winter evenings, when he has fallen asleep at his table, I have heard him, what I should prefer to describe as partially choke. I have heard him on such occasions produce sounds of a nature similar to what may be sometimes heard in Dutch clocks. Not,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, with a lofty sense of giving strict evidence,
"that I would convey any imputation on his moral character. Far from it. I have always considered Bitzer a young man of the most upright principle, and to that I beg to bear my testimony."
"Well,"
said the exasperated Bounderby,
"while he was snoring, or choking, or Dutch clocking, or something or other, being asleep, some fellows somehow, whether previously concealed in the house or not remains to be seen, got to young Tom's safe, forced it, and abstracted the contents. Being then disturbed, they made off, letting themselves out at the main door, and double locking it again. It was double locked, and the key under Mrs. Sparsit's pillow, with a false key, which was picked up in the street near the bank about 12 o'clock to-day. No alarm takes place till this chap Bitzer turns out this morning, and begins to open and prepare the offices for business. Then, looking at Tom's safe, he sees the door ajar, and finds the lock forced, and the money gone."
Where is Tom, by the by?
asked Harthouse, glancing round.
"He's been helping the police,"
said Bounderby,
"and stays behind at the bank. I wish these fellows had tried to rob me when I was at his time of life. They'd have been out of pocket if they'd invested 18p in the job, I can tell them that."
Is anybody suspected?
"Suspected? I should think there was somebody suspected. God!
said Bounderby, relinquishing Mrs. Sparsit's arm to wipe his heated head.
Josiah Bounderby of Coketown is not to be plundered, and nobody suspected. No, thank you.
Might Mr. Harthouse inquire who was suspected?
I'll tell you,
said Bounderby, stopping and facing about to confront them all.
It's not to be mentioned everywhere. It's not to be mentioned anywhere, in order that the scoundrels concerned, there's a gang of 'em, may be thrown off their guard. So take this in confidence. Now, wait a bit.
Mr. Bounderby wiped his head again.
What should you say to—
Here he violently exploded.
To a hand being in it?
I hope,
said Harthouse lazily.
not our friend Blackpot?
Say pool instead of pot, sir,
returned Bounderby.
And that's the man.
Louisa faintly uttered some word of incredulity and surprise.
Oh, yes, I know,
said Bounderby, immediately catching at the sound.
I know. I'm used to that. I know all about it. They're the finest people in the world, these fellows are. They've got the gift of the gab, they have. They only want to have their rights explained to them, they do. But I tell you what, show me a dissatisfied hand, and I'll show you the man that's fit for anything bad. I don't care what it is.
Another of the popular fictions of Coketown, which some pains have been taken to disseminate, and which some people really believed.
But I am acquainted with these chaps,
said Bounderby.
I can read them off, like books. Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am, I appeal to you. What warning did I give that feller the first time he set foot in the house, when the express object of his visit was to know how he could knock religion over and floor the established church? Mrs. Sparsit, in point of high connections, you are on a level with the aristocracy. Did I say, or did I not say to that feller, you can't hide the truth from me. You're not the kind of fellow I like. You'll come to no good.
Assuredly, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
You did, in a highly impressive manner, give him such an admonition.
When he shocked you, ma'am,
said Bounderby.
When he shocked your feelings.
Yes, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit, with a meek shake of her head.
He certainly did so. Though I do not mean to say but that my feelings may be weaker on such points, more foolish, if the term is preferred, than they might have been, if I had always occupied my present position.
Mr. Bounderby stared with a bursting pride at Mr. Harthouse, as much as to say,
I am the proprietor of this female, and she is worthy of your attention, I think.
Then resumed his discourse.
You can recall for yourself, Harthouse, what I said to him when you saw him. I didn't mince the matter with him. I'm never mealing with 'em. I know 'em. Very well, sir. 3 days after that he bolted. Went off nobody knows where, as my mother did in my infancy. Only with this difference, that he's a worse subject than my mother, if possible. What did he do before he went? What do you say?
Mr. Bounderby, with his hat in his hand, gave a beat upon the crown at every little division of his sentences, as if it were a tambourine.
To his being seen, night after night, watching the bank. To his lurking about there after dark. To its striking Mrs. Sparsit that he could be lurking for no good. To her calling Bitzer's attention to him, and they're both taking notice of him, and to its appearing on inquiry to-day that he was also noticed by the neighbours.
Having come to the climax, Mr. Bounderby, like an oriental dancer, put his tambourine on his head.
Suspicious,
said James Harthouse.
Certainly.
I think so, sir,
said Bounderby, with a defiant nod.
I think so. But there are more of 'em in it. There's an old woman. One never hears of these things till the mischief's done. All sorts of defects are found out on the stable door after the horse is stolen. There's an old woman turns up now. An old woman who seems to have been flying into town on a broomstick every now and then. She watches the place a whole day before this feller begins. And on the night when you saw him, she steals away with him and holds a council with him. I suppose to make her report on going off duty, and be damned to her."
There was such a person in the room that night, and she shrunk from observation, thought Louisa.
"That is not all of 'em, even as we already know 'em,"
said Bounderby, with many nods of hidden meaning.
"but I've said enough for the present. You'll have the goodness to keep it quiet, and mention it to no one. It may take time, but we shall have 'em. It's policy to give 'em line enough, and there's no objection to that."
Of course they will be punished with the utmost rigour of the law, as notice boards observe,
replied James Harthouse.
"And serve them right. Fellows who go in for banks must take the consequences. If there were no consequences, we should all go in for banks."
He had gently taken Louisa's parasol from her hand, and had put it up for her, and she walked under its shade, though the sun did not shine there.
"For the present, Lou Bounderby,"
said her husband,
"here's Mrs. Sparsit to look after. Mrs. Sparsit's nerves have been acted upon by this business, and she'll stay here a day or two, so make her comfortable."
"Thank you very much, sir,"
that discreet lady observed.
"but pray do not let my comfort be a consideration. Anything will do for me."
It soon appeared that if Mrs. Sparsit had a failing in her association with that domestic establishment, it was that she was so excessively regardless of herself and regardful of others as to be a nuisance. On being shown her chamber, she was so dreadfully sensible of its comforts as to suggest the inference that she would have preferred to pass the night on the mangle in the laundry. True, the Powlers and the Scadgerses were accustomed to splendour,
"But it is my duty to remember,"
Mrs. Sparsit was fond of observing with a lofty grace, particularly when any of the domestics were present,
"that what I was I am no longer. Indeed," said
she,
"if I could altogether cancel the remembrance that Mr. Sparsit was a Powler, or that I myself am related to the Scadgers family, or if I could even revoke the fact, and make myself a person of common descent and ordinary connections, I would gladly do so. I should think it, under existing circumstances, right to do so."
The same hermetical state of mind led to her renunciation of made dishes and wines at dinner, until fairly commanded by Mr. Bounderby to take them, when she said,
"Indeed you are very good, sir,"
and departed from a resolution of which she had made rather formal and public announcement, to
"wait for the simple mutton."
She was likewise deeply apologetic for wanting the salt, and feeling amiably bound to bear out Mr. Bounderby to the fullest extent in the testimony he had borne to her nerves, occasionally sat back in her chair and silently wept, at which periods a tear of large dimensions, like a crystal earring, might be observed, or rather must be, for it insisted on public notice, sliding down her Roman nose. But Mrs. Sparsit's greatest point, first and last, was her determination to pity Mr. Bounderby. There were occasions when in looking at him she was involuntarily moved to shake her head, as who would say,
"Alas, poor Yorick!"
After allowing herself to be betrayed into these evidences of emotion, she would force a lambent brightness, and would be fitfully cheerful, and would say,
"You have still good spirits, sir, I am thankful to find,"
and would appear to hail it as a blessed dispensation that Mr. Bounderby bore up as he did. One idiosyncrasy for which she often apologized, she found it excessively difficult to conquer. She had a curious propensity to call Mrs. Bounderby
"Miss Gradgrind,"
and yielded to it some 3 or 4 score times in the course of the evening. Her repetition of this mistake covered Mrs. Sparsit with modest confusion, but indeed, she said, it seemed so natural to say Miss Gradgrind, whereas, to persuade herself that the young lady whom she had had the happiness of knowing from a child could be really and truly Mrs. Bounderby, she found almost impossible. It was a further singularity of this remarkable case, that the more she thought about it, the more impossible it appeared.
"The difference is,"
she observed,
"being such."
in the drawing-room after dinner, Mr. Bounderby tried the case of the robbery, examined the witnesses, made notes of the evidence, found the suspected persons guilty, and sentenced them to the extreme punishment of the law. That done, Bitzer was dismissed to town, with instructions to recommend Tom to come home by the mail train. When candles were brought, Mrs. Sparsit murmured,
"Don't be low, sir. Pray let me see you cheerful, sir, as I used to do."
Mr. Bounderby, upon whom these consolations had begun to produce the effect of making him, in a bull-headed blundering way, sentimental, sighed like some large sea-animal.
"I cannot bear to see you so, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
"Try a hand at backgammon, sir, as you used to do when I had the honour of living under your roof."
I haven't played backgammon, ma'am,
said Mr. Bounderby.
since that time.
"No, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit soothingly.
"I am aware that you have not. I remember that Miss Gradgrind takes no interest in the game. But I shall be happy, sir, if you will condescend."
They played near a window opening on the garden. It was a fine night, not moonlight, but sultry and fragrant. Louisa and Mr. Harthouse strolled out into the garden, where their voices could be heard in the stillness, though not what they said. Mrs. Sparsit, from her place at the backgammon board, was constantly straining her eyes to pierce the shadows without.
What's the matter, ma'am?
said Mr. Bounderby.
You don't see a fire, do you?
"Oh dear no, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"I was thinking of the dew."
What have you got to do with the dew, ma'am?
said Mr. Bounderby.
"It's not myself, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"I am fearful of Miss Gradgrind's taking cold."
She never takes cold,
said Mr. Bounderby.
"Really, sir?"
said Mrs. Sparsit, and was affected with a cough in her throat. When the time drew near for retiring, Mr. Bounderby took a glass of water.
"Oh, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
"not your sherry warm with lemon peel and nutmeg?"
Why, I've got out of the habit of taking it now, ma'am,
said Mr. Bounderby.
"The more's the pity, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"you are losing all your good old habits. Cheer up, sir. If Miss Gradgrind will permit me, I will offer to make it for you, as I have often done."
Miss Gradgrind readily permitting Mrs. Sparsit to do anything she pleased, that considerate lady made the beverage, and handed it to Mr. Bounderby.
"It will do you good, sir. It will warm your heart. It is the sort of thing you want, and ought to take, sir."
And when Mr. Bounderby said,
Your health, ma'am,
she answered with great feeling,
"Thank you, sir. The same to you, and happiness also."
Finally, she wished him good night, with great pathos, and Mr. Bounderby went to bed with a maudlin persuasion that he had been crossed in something tender, though he could not, for his life, have mentioned what it was. Long after Louisa had undressed and lain down, she watched and waited for her brother's coming home. That could hardly be, she knew, until an hour past midnight. But in the country silence, which did anything but calm the trouble of her thoughts, time lagged wearily. At last, when the darkness and stillness had seemed for hours to thicken one another, she heard the bell at the gate. She felt as though she would have been glad that it rang on until daylight, but it ceased, and the circles of its last sound spread out fainter and wider in the air, and all was dead again. She waited yet another quarter of an hour, as she judged. Then she arose, put on a loose robe, and went out of her room in the dark and up the staircase to her brother's room. His door being shut, she softly opened it and spoke to him, approaching his bed with a noiseless step. She kneeled down beside it, passed her arm over his neck, and drew his face to hers. She knew that he only feigned to be asleep, but she said nothing to him. He started by and by, as if he were just then awakened, and asked who that was, and what was the matter.
Tom, have you anything to tell me? If ever you loved me in your life, and have anything concealed from every one besides, tell it to me.
I don't know what you mean, Lou. You have been dreaming.
My dear brother.
She laid her head down on his pillow, and her hair flowed over him as if she would hide him from every one but herself.
Is there nothing that you have to tell me? Is there nothing you can tell me if you will? You can tell me nothing that will change me. Oh, Tom, tell me the truth.
I don't know what you mean, Lou.
As you lie here alone, my dear, in the melancholy night, so you must lie somewhere one night, when even I, if I am living then, shall have left you. As I am here beside you, barefoot, unclothed, undistinguishable in darkness, so must I lie through all the night of my decay until I am dust. In the name of that time, Tom, tell me the truth now.
What is it you want to know?
You may be certain.
In the energy of her love, she took him to her bosom as if he were a child.
That I will not reproach you. You may be certain that I will be compassionate and true to you. You may be certain that I will save you at whatever cost. Oh, Tom, have you nothing to tell me? Whisper very softly. Say only yes, and I shall understand you.
She turned her ear to his lips, but he remained doggedly silent.
Not a word, Tom.
How can I say yes, or how can I say no, when I don't know what you mean? Lou, you're a brave, kind girl, worthy I begin to think of a better brother than I am. But I have nothing more to say. Go to bed. Go to bed.
You are tired.
She whispered presently, more in her usual way.
Yes, I am quite tired out.
You have been so hurried and disturbed to-day. Have any fresh discoveries been made?
Only those you have heard of from him.
Tom, have you said to anyone that we made a visit to those people, and that we saw those three together?
No. Didn't you yourself particularly ask me to keep it quiet when you asked me to go there with you?
Yes, but I did not know then what was going to happen.
Nor I neither. How could I?
He was very quick upon her with this retort.
Ought I to say, after what has happened?
Said his sister, standing by the bed. She had gradually withdrawn herself and risen.
That I made that visit. Should I say so? Must I say so?
Good heavens, Lou,
returned her brother.
You are not in the habit of asking my advice. Say what you like. If you keep it to yourself, I shall keep it to myself. If you disclose it, there's an end of it.
It was too dark for either to see the other's face, but each seemed very attentive and to consider before speaking.
Tom, do you believe the man I gave the money to is really implicated in this crime?
I don't know. I don't see why he shouldn't be.
He seemed to me an honest man.
Another person may seem to you dishonest, and yet not be so.
There was a pause, for he had hesitated and stopped.
In short,
resumed Tom, as if he had made up his mind,
if you come to that, perhaps I was so far from being altogether in his favour that I took him outside the door to tell him quietly that I thought he might consider himself very well off to get such a windfall as he had got from my sister, and that I hoped he would make good use of it. You remember whether I took him out or not. I say nothing against the man. He may be a very good fellow, for anything I know. I hope he is.
Was he offended by what you said?
No, he took it pretty well. He was civil enough. Where are you, Lou?
He sat up in bed and kissed her.
Good night, my dear. Good night.
You have nothing more to tell me?
No. What should I have? You wouldn't have me tell you a lie.
I wouldn't have you do that tonight, Tom, of all the nights in your life, many and much happier as I hope they will be.
Thank you, my dear Lou. I'm so tired that I'm sure I wonder I don't say anything to get to sleep. Go to bed, go to bed.
Kissing her again, he turned round, drew the coverlet over his head, and lay as still as if that time had come by which she had adjured him. She stood for some time at the bedside before she slowly moved away. She stopped at the door, looked back when she had opened it, and asked him if he had called her. But he lay still, and she softly closed the door and returned to her room. Then the wretched boy looked cautiously up and found her gone, crept out of bed, fastened his door, and threw himself upon his pillow again, tearing his hair, morosely crying, grudgingly loving her, hatefully but impenitently spurning himself, and no less hatefully and unprofitably spurning all the good in the world. End of chapter 8.